So I recently read your article that you published on theconversation.com that pointed to this recent indictment of former Cuban President Raul Castro, which it's been a month now since that was unsealed, at least, that given our recent past with Venezuela and in Latin America, because you are a history professor and specialize in like more modern Latin American history, that this indictment might be pointing towards impending U.S. military action in Cuba. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's certainly the fear that's on a lot of people's minds right now. And the Trump administration has communicated it pretty openly, saying that, we may take direct military action against Cuba. So uh, at this point, they're really not hiding it.
Were those comments being made before the indictment came?
Um, I think they've certainly reached a new level of explicitness since the indictment. And as you mentioned, the indictment of the Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro, and then the U.S. bombing on January 3rd and abduction of Maduro, is the immediate precedent that's on everyone's minds. That indictment is widely interpreted as a way of justifying the U.S. military action that followed very soon after. And that may well happen with Cuba. That's certainly a distinct possibility right now. And, the U.S. has often threatened Cuba rhetorically. But I think that the explicitness of the threat certainly has ramped up since the indictment in May.
Do you think that Venezuela and Cuba are connected in specifically in the context of the indictments? I mean, I didn't realize until starting to look into and researching to talk to you that 30 something Cuban, it said officers were killed, which I think was probably just a misnomer that someone used who isn't familiar with the military, but that there were 30 something Cuban military members that were killed when we went in and kidnapped Maduro. So do you think these are linked or that this is a coincidence?
Well, Cuba and Venezuela have had a close relationship since Hugo Chavez came into power in Venezuela in 1999. And that relationship has persisted under Maduro from 2013 up until the start of this year when he was kidnapped. So the relationship politically and economically has been very important between Cuba and Venezuela. Venezuela has provided much of Cuba's oil, so it has acted as a kind of economic lifeline to the Cuban economy, which Cuba has sorely needed. And since January 3rd, when the U.S. went in, much of the rationale for that, much of the underlying motivation was to cut off the supply of oil to Cuba, and which they've done since January, right? There has been barely any oil entering Cuba. And that was certainly one of the primary motivations behind the operation in Venezuela. So from the perspective of the United States, these two countries are very closely linked, and they've both been governed by people who are explicit about their opposition to the historical U.S. policy in the region, which has been one of control for a very long time. And so the actions that we've seen from the Trump administration this year, of course, have a very deep set of historical precedents. If we go back just to the Cold War period, the United States government participated in either directly or indirectly the overthrow of 24 different governments in Latin America alone, right? That number might surprise some people, even people who have, some historical sense that the U.S. has been doing these kind of things for a long time. And that's just the Cold War. That's just roughly 1945 to 1990. And that's a calculation from the historian John Coatsworth. 24 U.S. overthrows of Latin American governments, either through direct military action, but more commonly through more behind-the-scenes actions, supporting the military coups by Latin American military officers.
And funding rebel groups and things like that, just like we did with the Bay of Pigs.
Right,
Same playbook.
absolutely. Right. So funding and training and equipping and providing refuge for Cuban exiles after 1959 who have engaged in all kinds of military operations against Cuba over the past 67 years. And there are other cases as well. Nicaragua in the 1980s was a pretty well-known example that got a lot of attention, where the U.S. Trained and equipped the so-called Contra forces, the counter-revolutionary forces, to try to overthrow the Nicaraguan government that had taken power in 1979. And there are other examples around the world where the United States has done that. It hasn't just been um, overthrowing governments directly. Often it takes the form of the United States funneling aid and other kinds of support to domestic rebel forces within the military or otherwise to try to overthrow those governments.
Hmm. I guess with moving on Venezuela to cut off the supply to Cuba, I mean, the way I see this from the outside looking in and then having military background, I know Cuba has a couple Chinese and Russian signals intelligence operations going on there that are, publicly recognized. And I'm sure there's more to it. Obviously, there's the proximity to the US, which is very similar. China has the same problem with us having a presence in Taiwan, 80 something miles off their coast. And now we have Cuba with the Russian and Chinese presences 90 something miles off of our coast. Like very, very parallel situations there to some degree. Do you think that, and then obviously the tensions that we've, with us funding the Ukrainian war, tensions with us and Russia there, and then the tensions that have been building with China, that this is why we finally moved on Venezuela to kind of excise Cuba here?
I think the roots of U.S. hostility to Cuba go back a lot further. Usually in this country, it's talked about in the context of the Cold War and Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union, which it forged soon after the 1959 revolution, not immediately after. The U.S. Became hostile to the revolution already in 1959, before the Cubans had any kind of a close relationship with the Soviets, which is an important bit of historical context to bear in mind. But the roots of U.S. policy toward Cuba go way back. We can go back, for example, to 1823. That's the year of the Monroe Doctrine, most famously, where President James Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, articulated this sense of U.S. Control, or U.S. right to control the Western Hemisphere. Also in 1823, John Quincy Adams, while he was still the Secretary of State, talked about Cuba. There was a lot of talk of Cuba at the time, and John Quincy Adams says, Cuba is an object of transcendent importance to the political and commercial interests of our union. So that's a direct quote. And that quote really encapsulates a lot about U.S. policy over the last 2 centuries. That one, Cuba is an object, which reveals something about how U.S. officials have thought about Cuba and its people. And it's important for both political and economic reasons. Of course, we have economic interest in Cuba, not so much at the time that John Quincy Adams was writing that, but by the late 19th century, there were a lot of U.S. investments in Cuba. It was one of the primary destinations for U.S. investment by the turn of the 20th century. And there continue to be economic interests at stake today, even though the U.S. doesn't have direct foreign investment since the revolution. Politically, Cuba has also signified a source of resistance to U.S. policy within the context of
Uh,
Latin America and around the world, and so it represents the ability of a small country, and the proximity to the U.S. is important here. It's 90 miles off the U.S. coastline, and it has been able to defy the United States with a great degree of success. We can talk about the successes and failures of the Cuban economic or political model, but the fact remains that the U.S. has not accomplished its primary goal of overthrowing the government since 1959. And so Cuba has become almost an obsession of U.S. policymakers. And now we see that especially with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who has had a particular and deeply personal interest in overthrowing the Cuban government. But it goes much deeper than Rubio, is the point I'm trying to make. It has had this transcendent importance, as John Quincy Adams said. And so in the current context, Cuba does have a relationship with countries like Russia and China. It has an economic relationship, although it should be noted that neither Russia nor China has been leaping at the chance to come to the aid of Cuba in the midst of this oil blockade and what is essentially a total economic blockade imposed by the United States since January. And so that it gives an indication of the limits of China and Russia's willingness to intervene on behalf of Cuba. Now, the military component of that relationship, I think, is often overstated here in the United States. Certainly Cuba and Venezuela have had some military links with Russia and China, but it's nothing like a relationship of subordination or control by those countries, right? Cuba is a sovereign country. It has accepted military aid from certain other countries, but as most countries around the world do. The difference here is that Cuba is 90 miles off the U.S. coastline, and it has long defied the United States. And that has infuriated U.S. policymakers. And another difference, one difference from Taiwan or other examples we could point to, is that the U.S. has a long record of direct intervention in Cuban affairs, economically, militarily, in terms of support for the Bay of Pigs invasion, but all kinds of other interventions since 1959. And then if we want to go back before 1959, there's a long history of direct U.S. intervention as well.
yeah, and I guess, I mean, part of it you've highlighted, it's almost like a thorn in our side because we haven't been able to rein it in, but it's why, I guess, is that why you think that we have crossed that line of doing, I guess, crossing the line into where there's no denying that we've had a role in what was going on. And I know, reading about the Bay of Pigs, like Kennedy kind of tried even still riding a line, and that's why some of the air support was withdrawn from that assault. But it's again at the surface level understanding of some of the things that I know about it, like even Operation Northwoods, or the backing of it seems like some of these members that were, or I get the pilot who was one of the surviving pilots from these flights that were shot down, as that are being referenced from 1996 that are being used in this indictment. Like, we've kind of tiptoed along that line where it seems like it's known that it is us backing these things, but without an outright admission of it. Like, why do you think it's so unique for Cuba as opposed to everywhere else that we do that?
I think it's because we can get away with it, or at least we think we can get away with it. And The Trump administration has really removed the cloak of concern for human rights or democracy or international law. Trump and his team just come right out and say it. I don't need international law. That's what Trump said in January after the Venezuela operation. He's guided by his own morality, he said. And so this explicit dismissal of international law, international norms and opinions is something that does mark a break with prior U.S. administrations. Um, it's a break. It's a difference of degree
Mhm.
because the U.S. has long discarded or disregarded international law when it has seen it as in its interest to do so. But Trump comes out and says it explicitly. And I think that there's a sense that there aren't going to be any consequences. And, Trump really hasn't faced serious consequences. I think that he hasn't accomplished everything he wants, certainly in Iran. That's the clearest present day example where he hasn't gotten what he wanted. And had Iran not become such a difficult foreign policy issue for Trump, there may well have been a U.S. military operation in Cuba already. And after January 3rd, with the bombing in Venezuela, I think that there was a sense that we can do anything we want, essentially, even if it's directly invading other countries. Um, I think that Trump is trying to avoid direct large scale occupation of foreign countries, like Iraq, for example. But there are all kinds of U.S. intervention short of direct large scale occupation, and Venezuela was a good example. And coming out of January 3rd, I think that he felt like he was riding really high, and if he wanted to do this in Cuba, well, nobody was going to stop him. And it remains a possibility that he may escalate to direct military action. But it's hard to predict the future at this point. But I think that the bottom line is there is a sense of impunity that might makes right. And Trump administration officials have been remarkably candid that is the way that they think about the world. They've dispensed with any pretense of even caring about sovereign equality, the central principle of international law, and respect for the rights of other nations. Right? We are the strongest. We can do what we want.
Yeah. I do you think that's posturing to some extent? Because, I do have to admit, when I found out, I had two thoughts when I found out about Venezuela and us going in. I was like, on one hand, that is freaking crazy, and what does that mean moving forward? And obviously now we're starting to see potentially with insights like yours into what might be coming next downstream of that. But also it was like, I can't believe our military is freaking capable of that. Like Delta Force going in there like that and just it it kind of felt like, again, with keeping in mind what we have going on with Russia and I would say more specifically China, at least in my mind, that this was a, hey, this is what we can do if need be. Does it seem, with you having that, the much broader context and understanding of everything, do you think that is part of this? And did Venezuela have similar ties that Cuba has with China and Russia at all?
There was a relationship between the Maduro government and China and Russia. Uh, I would say it was primarily economic in nature, military ties to some extent as well. But I think that the underlying U.S. motivation um, doesn't have a lot to do with Russia and China directly. It has
Okay.
more to do with economic interest of the United States and the political or geopolitical interest in restoring what Trump administration officials themselves call U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. They use that kind of wording,
Mhm.
and So China in particular is certainly on their mind in the larger global sense, right? They certainly see China as the primary global competitor,
Mhm.
and it's primarily a competitor in economic terms, right? The Chinese economy has grown by leaps and bounds over the last several decades, especially since the turn of the century, and in many ways, it rivals, or in some cases, even outdoes the United States economy. And so there is tremendous concern about that within the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And I think this desire by the Trump administration, this emphasis on restoring dominance in the Western Hemisphere, is partly about China and Russia, but it's in a more global sense, in a more big picture sense than about the specific ties between China and Cuba or Russia and Cuba. I think they do see the U.S. China rivalry in that broader regional and global sense, more so than seeing Chinese economic presence in Cuba as a direct threat to the United States.
Do you, in thinking about all this, has China's Belt and Road Initiative and their presence in places like Argentina and Peru and kind of all throughout that region and starting to integrate themselves into those cultures, do you think, have you, has it crossed your mind that that's played a role in all of this as well? Or no? I know, again, we're still kind of talking about the global picture, but it is creeping down into Latin America, obviously, with that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of Chinese investment in Latin American countries over the last 2 decades or so, and that is part of U.S. officials' thinking. And it hasn't just been in Latin America. It's China has expanding economic relationships all over the world, and that is certainly a source of concern to the United States. Now, even though it doesn't pose a direct security threat per se, at least in terms of a military or intelligence threat to the United States, but it does constitute a threat in the eyes of U.S. officials because China is this rising economic power, and it's developing these relationships around the world, which U.S. officials fear will crowd out U.S. private foreign investors and trade in these other countries.
Yeah, I mean, in your time studying all of this, have you seen a significant impact, I guess, of their investments down there of China? I know they're building dams and highways and other things. Like, has it started to shift anything down there at all? Like noticeably to where you can tie it to that?
In terms of politics, or
Yeah, maybe I get just the general, yeah, I guess politics and maybe the public sentiment around, I don't know if you get that big of a read into, some of, because some of this stuff I do think it's hearts and minds to some extent. So a read culturally, I guess, in that sense of disposition towards America versus China versus any of these other bigger picture things that are starting to kind of play out over time.
yeah, it's a good question. I can speak about the countries that I've visited in the last several years, Bolivia being one. The Chinese economic relationship with Bolivia has expanded, and there's a consciousness of that. There's an awareness of that among Bolivians I've talked to. Uh, I guess I still don't see the Chinese cultural presence as uh, being very visible to the extent that the U.S. cultural presence traditionally has been. I think there is more of a gulf or a chasm between um, Chinese and Latin American cultures, right? The U.S. and Latin America, have. I think culturally they're a little bit closer in terms of religion, in terms of who they were colonized by. There are certain historical and cultural ties that maybe make make it a little easier for Latin Americans to relate to the United States than to China. So I don't see a major cultural shift or political shift as a result of Chinese increasing investments in Latin American economies. I think that there is, uh, I mean, there's a lot of neutrality or even goodwill toward China. I would say that there's certainly a range of sentiment among Latin Americans about, their country's relationships with China. There's, some degree of xenophobia, uh, which goes deep back in Latin America's own history. Um, anti-Chinese sentiment.
Mhm.
Um, but in terms of how Latin Americans perceive the Chinese government and how they perceive the U.S. government, it's a good question. And some of the best evidence comes from these annual polls that are done by this organization called NIRA, which is NIRA. They assemble a report each year called the Democracy Perception Index. And then they have a complementary report called the Country Perception Index. And it's this incredibly detailed data from all around the world on how people perceive other countries. And so they poll tens of thousands of people around the world. It's a very large scale operation. And one of the striking findings from recent years is that people around the world, I'm not talking specifically about Latin America, but Latin America is part of it, um, view the United States as more of a threat than the Chinese government. Um, the governments of China and even Russia, even Putin's government, are viewed not necessarily in glowing terms by people, but they don't see, the world's publics don't see China and Russia as being as big a threat as the United States is, which is a striking fact to observe. And this has been pretty consistent in global public opinion polls in recent years.
Yeah, that's something I would say probably this year that I've has maybe started to come on my radar, and that this, obviously I'm very proud to be an American. I'm proud of having served and all these things. I think I definitely I have that idea of America. And I still think it's the greatest country on earth to be living in. But I'm starting to see that, our idyllic view, I think, of ourselves as a nation that a lot of us have. I know not everybody does, but I'm not alone in feeling that way. That is that a lot of times that doesn't extend too far outside of our borders.
Yeah,
It's Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, it's a great reflection, and I always think it's important uh, to define what we mean when we say the country. What is the country? Is it the government that rules the country and conducts our domestic and foreign policy? Is it the people, right? Is it the culture? Is it the history? Because all of these things are incredibly complicated. The United
Yeah.
States has never been a unified society, all acting with a common purpose or sharing a common set of culture or values or principles. That's never been true, and it's not true today. And if we look at the population and aspects of our culture. Certainly, there are lots of good things. I agree with you. And the people in the country, I think by and large, people in this country are good people. Um, but I think that the problem for me arises when people conflate the U.S. government with the U.S. population, as if the U.S. government
Yeah.
automatically reflects the will of the people or the values of the people. And historically, I don't think that's true, and it's certainly not true today. And one of the things that I've noticed traveling in various Latin American countries over the years, which has been really striking, is the way that people differentiate between our government and our population. So when I talk to people in Bolivia or El Salvador or other places where I've spent significant time, they'll often say, I don't like the U.S. government, but that doesn't mean I don't like the U.S. people. So they're very careful to distinguish. At least the people I know are careful to distinguish between the two. And so uh, foreign populations are capable of making those distinctions. And, I've often been welcomed, usually been welcomed, I'll say, right, as tall, white gringo coming to Latin American countries. I'm usually received very, very warmly.
You see, you've been pronouncing the different Latin names or Spanish names. I've been like, man, I assumed you were Latin yourself, but
Oh,
that's
no,
you got
it's
it down. Yeah, you
it's a
fooled the blind
compliment.
guy.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I learned Spanish enough. At least I can usually pronounce the names all right. But
Yeah,
Latin Americans would certainly still pick up on my gringo accent.
yeah. It is an interesting thing though. I feel like probably now more than ever, we as Americans are starting to differentiate ourselves from the government as well. Obviously, there's always been a 50-50 split of who's in favor of the current administration versus not. But I think in the past several years, and I don't know how much of this is me paying more attention to me getting older versus how things are actually playing out. It does feel like in these last two administrations, like the gap between at least the farther ends, it seems like the distance between the two far ends is increasing, and that we are, especially with these last couple of wars that have popped off, and then all this the Epstein stuff, like now people are starting to separate and be, I think, probably more disenfranchised from the government than we ever have been, and maybe gotten more of a tangible picture of just how separate we as a culture and society are from the powers that be.
Mhm.
It, so maybe we're catching up to other places, I guess, where we're starting to see that and be able to separate the two. But I I brought you very, very broad, and I want to make sure that I don't drag us too far off. And if so, and I'm totally happy to keep following down these things, but I wanted to talk to you specifically about this Cuba thing. So I guess as I start to rein you back in from my very broad questions, the uh, how do you have a certain feeling of imminence on this potential action, and maybe an insight as to why, was indicting Raul Castro specifically? Is that us grasping at straws to find some sort of a reason, if you are speculating here and following this realization that you've had in recognizing this?
Yeah, I think in Venezuela, it certainly was an attempt to fashion some sort of a justification. Even though it was a very flimsy one from a legal perspective, to
Mhm.
say that, well, we indicted this person, and so we have a right to go enforce the indictment by bombing and invading them. That's not permissible under international law. And the authority that issued the indictment in the case of Venezuela was a U.S. attorney in New York who had been appointed by Donald Trump, someone with no prosecutorial experience prior to that appointment. And he's the guy, his name's Jay Clayton, who's now being nominated as head of intelligence by Trump. And so, it's a familiar pattern in U.S. Policymaking, right? We issue an edict and then we say, others around the world are bound to abide by this. So when we intervene, we are simply enforcing the law. Well, the law, as we conceive it, is what we have declared. And so that's part of what the United States has been saying in regard to Cuba as well,
Mm,
and Venezuela, even prior to January, when U.S. military was intercepting boats that were traveling through the Caribbean. Um, it would say these are sanctioned vessels. Well, sanctioned by whom? They're sanctioned by the United States, right? The U.S.
Yeah.
declaring a sanction on a sovereign entity doesn't give it a right to enter international waters and engage in that form of what is really essentially piracy.
Yeah, and I mean it's so I mean there's been so much going on here between that. Obviously, then you connect the dots from that to okay, Maduro's connected to narco terrorism to it's we're able to do this because we are a such a large country with a large military and these things, but it's I mean how because timeline wise, I mean, I'm not familiar with it. Between us doing that and then indicting Maduro and going in, do you know roughly how long it was from indictment to us going in?
It was very soon after. I don't know precisely. Um, eh, the Trump administration actually did indict Maduro in 2020 before they left office. This was,
Okay.
I think it was early 2020, around the same time that the pandemic was hitting. But there wasn't military action then. Uh, but now with this second indictment over narco terrorism charges, the military action followed very quickly. And so it's hard to speculate about what exactly is constraining the U.S. at this point. I think that in Cuba, that is, I think that um, most of the world has essentially abandoned Cuba. Economically speaking, most of the world has agreed not to do business with Cuba, right? And so I mentioned
Because of us.
because of the United States, right?
Okay.
And so this is an indication of the awesome power that the U.S. wields on the global stage through both military and economic forms of pressure. And one of the big levers that Trump has, of course, been fond of using is the threat of tariffs against other countries. And so the threat of tariffs against, say, Mexico or Brazil, two major Latin American economies, both producers of oil, who are certainly in an economic position to come to the aid of Cuba, um, and have nonetheless cut off their trade, most of their trade with Cuba, in response to U.S. pressures. And that is primarily due to the fear of U.S. economic retaliation, more so than the threat of military action by the U.S. Mexico's major market is still the United States. And so the threat of tariffs on Mexican imports into the United States is a big concern for the government of Mexico and Brazil too, and almost every other country around the world. The U.S. still has incredible economic power that it can wield. And even in the case of these major powers like Russia and China, they really haven't shown much interest in coming to Cuba's aid. And so, what exactly is constraining the Trump administration? Why hasn't it just launched an operation in the Venezuelan style to take out the government? It's not entirely clear to me, and I know we'll get more information as the months go on. Um, but I think that part of the constraint is a deep uncertainty about, what the hell is going to happen in Cuba if the United States takes out the government. Uh, it's not necessarily going to produce an outcome that even the Trump administration and its allies would be happy with. For one thing, it might lead to a massive exodus of Cubans from the island, as the country just plunges into political, economic, and maybe even military chaos. And so that outcome wouldn't
Yeah.
be desirable, even from the perspective of Trump's team. And so I think that has been one constraint on the U.S. Up to this point. But that being said, the U.S. is causing severe disruption in Cuba just by what it's already doing.
The
By
blackouts.
Right, the
Yeah.
blackouts, and we need to underscore just how serious this disruption is domestically for Cubans. The blackouts, it's not just people's houses going dark. When we talk about these blackouts in the Cuban electric system, we're talking about incubators, right, not being able to run in the hospitals. We're talking about ventilators uh, being inoperable. All kinds of different systems, from water and sanitation to agriculture, the production of food. These things are dependent on fuel, and fuel is the source of most of the electricity supply in Cuba. And so choking off the supply of oil to Cuba has had devastating consequences, more so than any other economic measure that the U.S. has taken. It has really hampered the electrical system, the power system in Cuba, the hospitals. And so when the U.S. goes after the electrical supply like this, it has lethal consequences, right? And in any such situation, it's the most vulnerable people who are the most impacted. And so we're talking about small children, infants and small children, and we're talking about the elderly and the disabled and other people who rely on consistent medical care, right? Cancer
Mhm.
patients, right? Um, People who need dialysis treatments, right? These are the kinds of things that people in Cuba are now doing without. There was a study that came out in a British medical journal a few months ago in February. This was the journal BMJ Pediatrics, for anybody who wants to look it up. And it found that between 2018 and 2025, the Cuban infant mortality rate, right, more than doubled, went up by 148% over just that 7-year period. And translating that statistic into actual lives, the number of babies who died, who otherwise would not have died if the maternal infant mortality rate remained consistent. We're talking about 1,800 infants who died, right, during that period.
Yeah.
And that only goes up until 2025. That's not
So
even counting
pre-Venezuela. Yeah.
it's pre-Venezuela and the severe crisis, which is worse now than at any point in that prior period. And so, I shudder to even think what the statistics are going to show later on. But people are dying, and people in the United States need to recognize that it's not just about, not being able to light your house. It's about people actually suffering um, lethal consequences of these sanctions. And the consequences are also going to be long term. When you don't have fuel, you can't power tractors. When you don't have tractors, you can't produce as much food. And so there are all kinds of consequences for health in Cuba, for food production, for water and sanitation, all of these essential aspects of the society, which are now being devastated by these U.S. actions.
And with that increase coming in those years before all this, was that just from the economic restrictions that we had in place on them? Is that what this is being tied to?
So it was certainly uh, due in large part to the Trump administration's intensification of sanctions. So the first Trump administration significantly intensified U.S. sanctions, which go back to 1960s when the U.S. embargo or blockade was first initiated. But Trump really tightened them in various ways, made it harder for other countries and other foreign corporations to trade with Cuba or invest in Cuba, because the U.S. wielded this economic lever to threaten third parties that tried to do business with Cuba. And so many businesses, not just U.S. businesses, but companies around the world, shied away from Cuba for fear of incurring U.S. wrath. And so um, that's uh, that's probably the primary cause of that increase in infant mortality. And it was especially devastating, though, because of the particular conjuncture. This coincided with the early years of the COVID pandemic. So when that hits in 2020,
Oh,
Cuba's economy was hit very hard, much harder than many other countries.
is it
One
tourism?
of tourism in particular.
Hmm.
So the Cuban economy is has long relied to a significant degree on tourism revenue, and that took a big hit when COVID hit. And so that means less revenue. It means that Cuba doesn't have as much money to invest in healthcare or education or housing or nutrition and so on. All of that had health consequences. The tourism the drop in tourism has also been magnified by U.S. policy, both under Trump and more recently, too. It's been harder for U.S. citizens to travel to Cuba. And there's, it's been a confluence of factors then, confluence of the U.S. sanctions with other aspects of the economic conjuncture, which have been unfavorable to Cuba, like the COVID pandemic.
It's ridiculous because when you said those years, I was like, okay, well, why didn't they get lifted during the other administration? I didn't even think about the fact that okay, it hasn't been that long, and I already forgot that the lockdowns and all that. I mean, it
Yeah.
feels like that was so long ago, even though that was so recent still. But
Yeah, I think
just
a lot of us would prefer to forget
yeah,
and
that
to
was
move
just
on. Yeah.
strange time. Yeah. Uh, with the other thing that this has had in my mind is that this is uh, an attempt to maybe, which, and I think I probably had this thought before you posed or presented the fact that, our government probably doesn't have an ideal scenario in terms of replacing the government down there if we were to go in and overthrow it. But my thoughts were, okay, are we trying to cause an uprising from within to overthrow down there? But kind of seems, I read that the Cuban government is now arming their civilians in preparation of it. At least they're expecting to some extent this same thing that you're forecasting. And so it kind of seems like that's not working if they're willing to be arming their civilians. Have you thought of that being a part of the playbook here, or is that this just kind of idyllic thinking on my end of what might be, or not idyllic? That's not the right, that was not the right word, but I think you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that the logic of U.S. policy since at least 1960 has been to try to incite a domestic uprising within Cuba. That's what the U.S. planners thought the Bay of Pigs was going to trigger, right? These U.S. trained Cuban exiles land on the southern coast of Cuba in 1961, and they're going to touch off this dramatic nationwide uprising, which didn't happen. The population mostly rallied around the government. The invasion was, soundly defeated in, a matter of almost in a matter of hours, and so that was a case of the U.S. government really dramatically underestimating the domestic support that the Cuban government had in April of 1960 because of the reforms that the revolutionary government was implementing. Now we're in a very different context now. The Cuban government today doesn't have that same level of deep and broad popular support across the country. It does have considerable civilian support, certainly, but it's not to the extent that it was in 1960, and that's
Okay.
for a variety of reasons. But I think that that's still the goal of the United States is to try to increase the discontent of the Cuban population such that they will rise up and overthrow their government. And that's been explicit since 1960. We want to increase economic dissatisfaction and hardship, right? That's a verbatim from the State Department in April of 1960. And how exactly that's supposed to happen isn't quite clear. I don't think that there's any indication right now that there's going to be any kind of domestic armed uprising against the government. The Cuban government does have a strong military. It's, invested considerable resources in that since the revolution. The military has been one of the ways that the Cuban government has survived this long in the face of consistent U.S. attempts to overthrow it.
Just crazy. I mean, that's 90 miles off of our, our coast, man.
Mhm.
It's right there. Has there been a mass exodus since this, restrictions have gotten greatly increased by the fact that we've cut off the oil?
Um, I don't know that I've seen uh, figures for the last several months,
Okay.
but in the last several years, yes, there has been a large scale out migration from Cuba to. Some people have made their way to the U.S., but there's been emigration to a lot of different countries as well.
Mm.
Yeah. And so I think that that's just to go back to this question of what is constraining the U.S. I think that the U.S. government doesn't want several million Cubans to leave the island or try to leave the island, many of whom are going to try to come to the U.S. And so that concern for just the utter chaos that might ensue after overthrowing the government could be one of the things that is restraining the U.S. To some extent.
Yeah, I think it's that. I think we have a lot of irons in the fire in terms of where we're putting our efforts militarily, whether that be indirectly or directly. And then yeah, I mean between that, the exodus, and I think like you said, the okay, if we create a vacuum but don't have someone that we want to fill it, what's the point and what is going to happen there? And then is that just a failed state on top of that, which then we would also probably end up, providing support to, I would think at some point, as long as it was the there was an indication that we were seeing some form of democratic government that we wanted to see starting to grow there. But I don't know, man. It's one of the, I like that this is part of what kind of caught my attention with your article, aside from the fact that that's kind of jarring to see and no one is talking about it. I spoke with an economist on here several months ago who was talking. I'd written a book called Why Socialism Struggles. And so we were talking about all of this specifically. Venezuela had just happened, and he predicted that this was going to cause a fall of Cuba. But we never, like, the idea of our government stepping in never even crossed my mind or came up in that conversation. So it felt like there's a lot of things kind of coming together with when I saw your article. But it's it's hard to understand. I think given everything else that is going on, like why now? And I think it seems like maybe you're not even positive as to why right now, correct?
Mhm. Um, yeah, I can speculate about it without having a firm answer to that question.
Mm.
I think that the timing of U.S. military interventions often reflects a desire to distract from domestic problems and scandals. People
Absolutely.
mention the
Yeah.
Epstein files and, the way that Trump's foreign military interventions magically increased around the same time that he was facing a lot of domestic heat. And I think that that's a common thing with rulers around the world is that war does serve as a diversion, it does serve as a distraction from the domestic travails that they're facing. and the hits to their popularity. And a successful war is often a way to boost one's popularity. Um, an unsuccessful war, on the other hand, can have that opposite effect. And so I think that why now? When you ask why now, I think it's partly, because of domestic political factors in the United States.
Mhm.
It's also that sense of boldness, that emboldening that the Trump administration has felt like it's just, it's not subject to any sort of constraint. It can do whatever it wants.
Mhm.
And so, why not leap at the opportunity to accomplish this very long-standing goal of U.S. policy, which is to overthrow the Cuban government, and then claim it as this big victory, and rally some support from important constituencies for the Republican Party that could be
Yeah.
part of it. And so there's a number of things operating here, both the long-term goals and the specific calculations at this moment in time. And I think that one possible outcome here, which the United States is surely thinking about, is that it's not going to overthrow the Cuban government directly. But in the case of Venezuela, it didn't really overthrow the government. It did um, um, abduct the president, but most of the other officials remained in place. And so
Yeah.
in that sense, it wasn't overhauling the Venezuelan state in the sense of taking out personnel other than Maduro. In the case of Cuba, that could take the form of, maybe taking out, one or more officials, but more importantly, reorienting the policies of the Cuban government, short of outright regime change. That could be taken as a victory or sold as a victory by Trump and his team to say, "Look, we intervened, we forced this change. Now it's effectively a new regime, even if the personalities in charge are largely the same." That's the narrative that
Yeah.
Trump has given about Iran, right? Even though, right, the Iranian government didn't fall, we forced a change, and we've accomplished our goal, which I don't think many people honestly believe that. But in the case of Venezuela, the U.S. has forced major changes to policy. And in the case of Cuba, eh, that may well happen too. Just a few days ago, on June 18th, the Cuban government announced a big package of major economic reforms in the direction
Uh,
of liberalizing the economy, opening it up to greater foreign investment and ownership, making it easier for private investors to start businesses, including large businesses, employing over 100 workers, expanding private employment, freeing up prices to be determined by the market. So all of these hallmarks of the Cuban economic model are now coming into question, to say the least, to a greater extent than at any time since 1959. There have been various moments where the Cuban government relaxed some of its economic restrictions and regulations, but nothing to the extent that is suggested by this recent announcement from the Cuban government. It remains to be seen exactly how those measures are going to be enacted or implemented. But certainly in terms of what the Cuban government has said and the specific changes that it has announced, we're talking about potentially dramatic changes in what the Cuban economy looks like. And so the Trump administration may say, well, we accomplished that. We forced them to do that. And therefore, we have succeeded. So, how all of that's going to
mm,
play out, I don't know. But that's one possible exit from this current situation. But that being said, I really don't know what's going to happen.
yeah. Well, and I mean, there's so much there, even in what we just covered. I think on one hand, I think speaking to the distractions if we were able to pull off another like fantastic display of military power and going in and getting Raul Castro out like we did with Maduro, great distraction, also bolstering support where you're like, okay, our military is badass. Because that is like, regardless of how illegal that was, again, like that was the caveat of recognizing the craziness of us kidnapping a foreign president was the fact that our military was actually able to do that. I think that plays into probably you would think maybe some of the public perception around Iran, like maybe bolster some support there as well, which, that's obviously its own can of worms with everything that's going on there. But um, I do think everything that you said about that was accurate. But there's also, the with the economic side of this, and I kind of ashamed to admit this. I didn't know this until I was preparing to talk to you, that when Fidel Castro took over, that they expropriated basically all American assets in the country. I had no idea that was a thing. So prior to that point, keeping in line with this idea that maybe, I mean, if these changes do occur, like they're announcing that they are, or like their government is mentioning, and maybe things do start to open up again. Let's assume maybe that was one of the goals here. Do you know how big of a part, or like how substantial that was in terms of the American economy, like our interest there prior to 1959?
In terms of U.S. foreign investment on the island and
Yeah.
and trade with Cuba,
Yeah.
it was significant. By the early 20th century, uh, Cuba was one of the major destinations for U.S. foreign investment, which was largely centered in Latin America at that time. Um, no, the relative importance of Cuba to U.S. foreign investors had declined by the 1950s because the U.S. was investing all over the world by that point.
Okay.
But Cuba was still a significant source of economic wealth for U.S. companies. They did control much of the sugar economy and all kinds of other industries, right? Hotels and tourism and utilities and infrastructure. There's all kinds of U.S. investments in the 1950s that remained important. And so even if Cuba was not as central to U.S. foreign investment as it was 60 years before that, it was still important. And those displaced U.S. capitalists who had their properties expropriated, were an important political constituency. They even are still today. They or their descendants are still part of the forces that are agitating for a more aggressive stance toward Cuba. And one of the important things to note, though, is with economic expropriation, usually that implies um, compensation to the owners. It's just, you're being forced to sell, all right, but you are being compensated economically. And one of the sources for the conflict there was that, in terms of, say, take the Cuban land reform program, which is initiated first in May of 1959, and then it's expanded in 1963 to cover more of the agricultural territory. But the land redistribution program, which went after the large estates in Cuba, the sugar and tobacco estates, uh, involved expropriation, but it also involved compensation, right? Or the promise, at least, of future compensation by the Cuban government. But the Cuban government said, we are going to compensate you based on the assessed value of your properties at the time of expropriation. And we're going to base our calculations on what you've reported in your tax filings. And so many of the companies had been cheating on their taxes and dramatically undervalued the real value of their properties, and so were then set to receive much less compensation than they felt they were entitled to. And
That seems like a very strategic move on their part. They knew I'm sure they knew before they made that call that like that would be the trend. That
Right. And so that, that infuriated them. And that was something that happened in Guatemala too. The US, this is one of the cases where the US overthrew an elected Latin American government. And there, the primary sin of the Guatemalan government, from the U.S. perspective, was this major land reform program initiated in 1952, which redistributed land on a large scale. Huge percentage of the population, which was predominantly rural at that time, received land for the first time under this land redistribution. And much of that land came from this behemoth U.S. corporation called the United Fruit Company. And United Fruit Company had also cheated on its taxes by undervaluing its properties. And then when the government in Guatemala said, we'll compensate you based on how much you said your properties were worth, the company didn't like it. And so that's something that's happened in a number of different cases.
that's such a big fu to like this is it like you kind of even as mad as you are at it, you have to kind of respect that too and be like, yeah, you got me, like good one. But I don't know, man. I don't know. It's just all of this stuff is they're so dynamic and so complex that I mean, that's why I wanted to talk to you about all this because it's just I mean, it's impossible for a layman to have a full grasp of all the things going on here. Like really,
Hmm.
there's so much. And I mean, have what am I missing here that I haven't asked about in this context that I should be? Because I feel like there has to be a lot. But are there big ticket items that you're sitting here like gritting your teeth that I haven't asked you about?
Um, I would say, well, there thoughts that I have that are specific to Cuba, and then there's kind of zooming out the bigger global picture. And in terms of what's going on in Cuba, it's hard to understate the severity of the U.S. attacks, right? The economic blockade that's in place now, and this is especially painful to witness in the case of healthcare. The Cuban economic model, for whatever its faults, and there have certainly been deep flaws in the Cuban economic model, it's also done some things very well. And healthcare really has been the gem at the center of the Cuban revolutionary model. Cuba's had a world class healthcare system since the 1960s. It's been free. It's been universal. It has developed vaccines and antiviral drugs and all kinds of medications that, in some cases, not even the U.S. medical industry was able to develop those things, right?
This
Certain.
was part of their exchange with Venezuela, correct? And part of like with this oil was that they send some of their expertise in these areas down there.
Right, and this is another dimension of the U.S. economic blockade is Cuba has increasingly, since the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, which was a major devastation to the Cuban economy. Cuba plunged into a depression, which is, even exceeds what the Great Depression was in the United States. That's a different story, but since that, since the 1990s or so, the importance of these Cuban medical missions has increased greatly. There have been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in total over this period, medical professionals trained in Cuba who have been deployed around the world and provided medical services in dozens of different countries. Um, and that, sometimes provided free of charge, especially in the case of very poor countries or in contexts of disaster relief. But often the Cuban government was paid for those services. And so that became an important source of revenue for Cuba's government. It was an important lifeline. in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. And the deeper roots of that, those medical missions, were the money that the Cuban government invested in healthcare since the 1960s. Became a central priority for the revolution from the get-go. And the training of doctors and nurses, and the development of medications domestically. Cuba reached a point where it was able to produce over 2/3 of its medicines domestically, which is pretty remarkable
Wow.
for a small island nation.
Yeah.
Um, and this the progress in terms of healthcare has been nothing short of remarkable. And even as many aspects of the Cuban revolutionary model have been eliminated or reformed. The healthcare system has remained in place, and Cubans in general have typically been very happy with the healthcare system. Even those who are critical of the government have seen that as one of the great triumphs, perhaps the greatest triumph of the Cuban Revolution, and something that they're not willing to let go of. But
Mhm.
in the context of the U.S. blockade, and especially the oil blockade since this past January, the healthcare system is nearing collapse. It can't provide the essential
Hmm.
services, right, to keep infants alive, right, to keep cancer patients or the elderly alive, right. The child mortality rate for child cancer patients has gone way up, right. The infant mortality rate, as I said before, has
Yeah.
more than doubled in the past 8 years. And so the healthcare system, which at one point really was the central source of pride for the Cuban Revolution, has been thrust into this horrific, nightmarish state where doctors and nurses need to choose who's going to live and who's going to die, because they just don't have the resources. And so that's especially painful to see. And this is to zoom out to the global context a little bit more. This is a microcosm of how sanctions work, particularly unilateral and broad-based economic sanctions. This has become a central tool of U.S. policy. The U.S. Treasury Department actually calls sanctions the tool of first resort. Right? That's a quote. And
Really?
so, as direct U.S. military interventions, or large-scale military interventions, I'll say, have receded somewhat in importance, the U.S. has relied more and more on the use of economic sanctions, which uh, actually can be just as devastating to the target countries as military warfare is. There was a major study that was published in an academic journal called The Lancet Global Health last year, 2025. And it did a global analysis of the impact of unilateral U.S. sanctions since 1971. And over about a 50-year period, right, it looked at the mortality rate that was associated with sanctions. And one of the specific calculations it did which was for the period 2012 to 2021, I believe. So roughly a decade. It found that unilateral sanctions, like what we're talking about with Cuba, or the sanctions against Venezuela before that, or the sanctions against Iran, um, those sanctions were associated with over 500,000 deaths each year, right? 564,000 deaths each year from sanctions, right? That's approximately the same number as the people who have been killed in direct military conflict during that period.
Wow.
And so, just to underscore that the mortality, the lethality of sanctions is just as high as the mortality resulting from actual warfare. And so we need to see, and especially those of us in the U.S., whose government is, the main actor engaged in these unilateral sanctions, we need to recognize sanctions as a form of economic violence, and physical violence, and recognize what the impacts are, and what the logic is too. The logic is to inflict collective punishment on entire populations. And that's always been clear in the internal documentary record of the State Department. And uh, one other painful fact here is that in that study I referred to, 564,000 deaths each year. Um, Over half of those victims are under the age of 5.
Hmm.
And so once again, it's the most vulnerable who suffer the most when these kinds of sanctions are imposed. And so the word sanction might have a kind of almost benign connotation for many people, but we need to fully recognize what we're talking about when we refer to these sanctions. It's not a peaceful tool of diplomacy. Sanctions, especially when they are broad-based and target an entire civilian economy, uh, these have lethal consequences.
Yeah, and I do. I'm glad you pointed that out. I do think it's important to be careful to not run down slippery slopes with words of that. I mean, that's violence is violence. I don't think that's violence. It is causing death. I don't know. I think it's in some middle ground. It's obviously it's not this neutral thing that we're doing. I mean, that's why we project it. But I don't know. I don't think it's violence. I also don't know that it's not.
Mhm.
It is peaceful because it is not violence, but it is not a this it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Hey, there's no consequences to us imposing these sanctions on the government. That is trickling down, like you said, to affect the people, and half a million deaths associated with it, half of which were children under the age of 5. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's right. 51%.
That's a hard pill to swallow. I mean,
Mhm.
and I guess, do you have any ideas on what an alternative would be? Obviously, there's actual sending boots on the ground, which no one wants. But I mean, are there other successful means that large, the world's superpowers use to project power like that isn't so lethal, even though it's not overtly lethal in the way that, everyone sees it, the direct outcomes of it,
Mhm. Um, I mean, I don't think the world's superpowers should project power unilaterally. I
but
think
they're
that
going to.
we need to be working through the diplomatic institutions
Mm.
that are established, and they may be frail. They may have lots of internal problems themselves. The UN certainly does, but there is an international legal framework and diplomatic institutions for resolving conflicts. And, unfortunately, the United States, not alone, not exclusively the US, but the US has been at the forefront of this undermining of these international institutions like the UN and the different conventions of international law, which do exist. They were established, most of them after World War II, in the aftermath of, the greatest human devastation of the 20th century. And those institutions need to be protected and strengthened. The UN Charter, right? The Geneva Conventions,
Yeah.
the other kinds of international legal infrastructure that must be protected, and they need to be strengthened. And nations need to engage in diplomacy, real, genuine diplomacy, even with countries whose governments they don't like. Uh, if one nation can get away with it because if they can get away with flouting international law because they're too powerful, that undermines the entire structure and credibility of those international institutions. And so that's
Yeah.
something that I'm very concerned about with seeing the openness with which the Trump administration defies international law. We're at a very perilous moment for the future of humanity. If we talk about, one thing that hasn't come up is the very real danger of nuclear war. People don't think about it very much anymore because we're not in the Cold War, but that remains an ever-present danger. We're much closer to a possible nuclear conflagration than we tend to realize. And there are all kinds of other crises that need to be resolved through international diplomacy and negotiations in the decades ahead, right? Not least of which related to the climate crisis, which is going to have all kinds of devastating impacts, especially among the countries that did the least to contribute to the problem, Cuba among them. And so we need functioning institutions of international law and diplomacy. And
Mhm.
so for the US to be spitting in the face of those institutions at the very moment when those institutions are more crucial than ever to preserving humanity and preserving the livability of this planet that we live on uh, is one of the most destructive impacts of current U.S. Policy. It goes way beyond Cuba. If they can do this to Venezuela or to Cuba, what does that mean for the future of the international order? Right? Are we just
Mhm.
going to plunge collectively down into utter global chaos and unspeakable conflict and war and devastation, all right, as say the climate crisis intensifies? Right. Those are real questions, and I think we need to look them we need to look them in the eye clearly and recognize what the alternatives are. Right, we do have alternatives. The alternatives need to involve the use of international institutions rather than the resort to uh, uh, warfare or other kinds of coercive measures.
Yeah. And I do, I mean, it certainly feels like we're on the cusp of another world war between, I mean, we're functionally, I can't, to an extent, I feel like we almost are. It's just not direct, especially if Taiwan pops off on top of Iran and Ukraine. I mean, it's kind of, we're so close. We're so close. And it is, I don't know. It's maybe, I don't, unfortunately, if there's no reason to start actually utilizing those international bodies like you've mentioned, then I don't know that something will drive us to do it. But hopefully, I'm, it's otherwise. I mean, I don't know what the path forward is to withdraw from these things because it does. Yeah, we are creeping in a direction other than someone starting to be like, hey, we're getting a little squirrely and maybe recognize the these risks
Mhm.
involved. It's just chaos. It really is. There's chaos right now in terms of specifically, obviously, my like in the terms of these wars that are going on and
Mhm.
creeping towards more.
Yeah, and I share the skepticism about is it about these international institutions. Can we rely upon them? Will the powerful nations ever respect them? And I think we need to operate on the assumption that it's possible that we can build a functioning and equitable international order. Um, the survival of humanity may depend upon it. And we have had some successes. The very existence of the United Nations and the UN Charter, Geneva Conventions, humanitarian laws, um, eh, you know, those in themselves are accomplishments, and they've had they've had positive impact. If we look at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of the 1960s, um, that has had some success, even though we've had continuing nuclear proliferation. There's 9 nuclear armed states today, but if not for that treaty, there might have been 2 or 3 times that many who had nuclear weapons. And so we do need to recognize that progress is possible. We can make a positive impact. And we just, we have to give it everything we've got to try to provide a better future for ourselves, but especially for future generations.
Yeah, I think ending it on a more hopeful note like that is a nice way to go too. I feel like I hope we start to see the, and I think we kind of are. There's a lot of the smaller businesses that are starting to, or not, I mean, they're not small, obviously, if you're doing nuclear power, but nuclear power and nuclear energy is starting to come back into the zeitgeist, and it's a lot safer than it used to be. It's on a smaller, more modular scale now that they're trying to do. And I think that'll address some of the, hopefully over time, and it's not going to be fast by any means, but start to address some of these energy concerns that we have, which are large contributors to, I think the climate science, it seems like is somewhat being challenged or has been more recently. So I don't know what the real deal is there, but it's undeniable that humans have an effect, right? We don't know how, to what extent, I think is probably what's in question. But I think with some of these things, there's progress being made. I hope, or I like to think some of it's getting lost in the fact of, again, all the distractions that we have, and the fact that conventional media plays into a lot of this, the direness of this, right? The way that these things are packaged and what is focused on. Not that, these bigger issues, they should be getting focused on, but I think sometimes it leans into putting people in that more elevated level of alertness, specifically in regards to some things that are outside of our control. Like, right, okay, we don't have control over what our politicians are doing in Iran or in these other places right now. We have that during election cycles, obviously, but we can start focusing on some of these other issues, hopefully, that are on a smaller scope where we do have a direct impact on them. And so it sounds like, but the way I feel like you started to wrap that up, you do have hope, because there's a means to have an impact on these things. And so I know you've written a bunch of books, man. I mean, where people want to find your books and be able to delve into your mind more, and even your other writings. I mean, you're pretty prolific in the amount of stuff that you're putting out. So where can everyone find you at?
Sure. So I have a personal website. It's kevinyoung.org, which is kind of funny because I'm not an organization. I'm just a single person. But I think kevinyoung.com was already taken. So I made it
Always.
kevinyoung.org. So you can find links to all my articles and books and stuff there.
Awesome, man. Anything else you want to throw in before we wrap this thing up?
Um, as you were talking at the end there, I just thought back to an article that the late historian Howard Zinn wrote, before he died in 2010. Um, it was called "The Optimism of Uncertainty," and people looking for, we're all looking for reasons to be hopeful, reasons to be optimistic about the future. And, the scary reality is we just don't know what the future is going to hold. It's going to hold some very bad things, maybe some good things as well. And the optimism of uncertainty, Zinn said, comes from knowing that the future is not determined for us. That if you look back through history, uh, all of the times that we have been surprised or even shocked by outcomes, some of which have been very good outcomes, right? That we couldn't have predicted in the past. And those good outcomes came about through conscious human action, right? And determination to try to collectively improve our circumstances as a human species. And uh, uh, we need to remember that, right? That the uncertainty about the future in itself should be a cause for optimism, right? The optimism comes from knowing that we do have the power to shape the future.
Yeah, and don't be a nihilist about everything. Everything is not doom and gloom. But take it again, but
Right.
focus. If it's instead of letting that stuff run away with you, I think people get so scope wise almost so big on things that they feel like they don't have agency in the world and in
Mhm.
whatever capacity. That can be something as small as in their own personal life, or these much bigger issues. So I'll have to go look that essay up because I've never heard of that before.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's great. We can't always be focused on the global level. We need to, as the saying goes, think globally but act locally, right? And don't succumb to the feeling of powerlessness.
Yeah. Awesome, man. That's a great place to end this. Thank you so much for coming on and breaking this all down for us.
Yeah, thank you, Zach.
Yeah. And thanks everyone at home for listening to another episode of Going In Blind. If you are listening, please leave a rating and review wherever that is at, especially if it's on Apple Podcasts. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe to this thing and then share these things around. This is, trying to put more curiosity out into the world and hopefully a little more knowledge. So I think this was a great way to do that. So with all of that out of the way, I will see you next time. Bye.